I used to think the scariest thing in the world was telling the truth. I was wrong. The scariest thing is watching someone you love choose silence over you and still loving them anyway. For 6 years, I buried a feeling so deep I almost convinced myself it was gone. Then one rainy Tuesday, he came back, the same crooked smile, the same voice that used to make my chest ache when I was 17 and too afraid to admit why. I told myself I could handle seeing him again. I told myself it was just dinner, just a welcome home hug, just old friends catching up. But some doors, once you open them, don't close the same way twice. What I didn't know that night was that he had a secret of his own, one that would either destroy everything I'd spent years rebuilding, or finally give me the one thing I never let myself want. Stay with me because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. Rain hit the windows of the Hargrove house like it had somewhere urgent to be, and Micah Alden stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen he'd known since he was 11 years old, holding a bottle of wine he suddenly felt too nervous to open. Across the room, setting down a suitcase that had clearly seen 3 continents, stood Theo Hargrove, 29 now, broader through the shoulders, a faint scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before, and eyes that still found Micah's like no time had passed at all. "You didn't have to dress up for me," Theo said, and that voice, lower now, rougher at the edges, cracked something open in Micah's ribs that he'd spent years welding shut. "I didn't dress up," Micah lied, tugging self-consciously at the collar of the shirt he had, in fact, changed 3 times. Micah was 27, a violin restorer who spent his days coaxing warmth back into instruments other people had given up on, and his nights mostly alone in an apartment above a bakery that made the whole building smell like cinnamon. His best friend, Reezy Hargrove, had been the one constant of his adult life, loud, loyal, allergic to nonsense, and Reezy's older brother Theo had been, for most of that same stretch of years, the one person Micah had never let himself talk about, not even to himself, not really. Theo had left for an age relief posting overseas when Micah was 21, the same month Micah had almost told him something that would have changed both their lives. He'd chickened out. Theo left without knowing, and Micah had spent 6 years telling himself that not knowing was safer for everyone. Now Theo was back, discharged early, tired in a way that went past jet lag, and staying in his childhood bedroom down the hall from Reezy's old room, which meant staying 20 feet from every unfinished sentence Micah had never said out loud. "Reezy said you two still do Sunday dinners," Theo said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching Micah with an attention that felt entirely too focused for 2 people who were supposedly just old family friends catching up. "Every week, rain or shine." Micah finally got the wine open, poured 2 glasses more to give his hands something to do than because either of them had asked. "She'll be thrilled you're back, she's been insufferable about it for a month." "And you," Theo asked, "are you thrilled?" The question landed heavier than it should have for something so simple, and Micah made the mistake of looking up right as he answered, "Of course, your family." Something flickered across Theo's face, disappointment, maybe, or recognition of a lie dressed as politeness. But he only nodded and took the glass Micah offered, his fingers brushing Micah's for half a second longer than necessary. Over the following weeks, the Sunday dinners became something else entirely. Reezy, oblivious in the specific way only a sibling could be, would leave early for her night shifts at the hospital, and Mike and Theo would end up on the back porch long after the dishes were done, talking about nothing and everything: Theo's years abroad, the villages he'd helped rebuild, the nightmares he still had about a hospital that had run out of supplies during a flood. Micah told him about the violins, about the old woman whose late husband's instrument he'd spent 4 months restoring for free because she cried every time she touched the case. "You always did that," Theo said one night, the porch light throwing gold across half his face. "Fix things nobody else thought were worth saving. Sometimes the thing just needs someone patient enough to notice what's still good underneath," Micah said, and immediately felt the weight of his own sentence land somewhere it wasn't meant to. Theo didn't look away. "Is that a metaphor, Alden?" "Depends on whether you want it to be." It was the closest either of them had come to saying anything true, and for one suspended second the rain-soft night held its breath along with them, until Theo's phone buzzed with a message that made his jaw tighten, and he excused himself inside without explanation, leaving Micah alone with his half-finished sentence and a feeling he hadn't let himself name in years. The secret came out 3 weeks later, and it wasn't the one Micah had feared. Reezy called him in a panic on a Thursday afternoon, her voice thin with worry. He's not sick, is he? Tell me the truth, Micah. You'd tell me if he told you something. Micah's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? It turned out Theo hadn't come home early because his contract ended. He'd come home because during the flood relief mission, an infection from a wound he'd hidden from his team for too long had nearly cost him his leg, and doctors overseas had sent him back for treatment he'd been quietly attending twice a week without telling either of them, terrified that if people saw him as fragile, they'd stop seeing him as someone worth loving at all. Micah found him that evening at the overlook above the reservoir, the place they used to bike to as teenagers. Theo sitting on the hood of his car with his bad leg stretched carefully in front of him, staring at the water like it owed him an explanation. You should have told us, Micah said, sitting down beside him without being invited. I didn't want to be someone people worry about. Theo's voice was quieter than Micah had ever heard it. I spent years being the guy who runs toward disasters. I didn't know how to be the guy people had to slow down for. I would have slowed down for you, Micah said. I would have carried you if I had to. Theo turned to look at him then, really look, the way he had that first rainy night. Why? And this time, Micah didn't lie and he didn't look away. Because I've been in love with you since I was 17 years old and I have been terrified of it every single day since, and I am so tired of being terrified, Theo. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour and also no time at all. Then Theo reached over, careful, deliberate, and laced his fingers through Micah's like he'd been waiting 6 years for permission to do exactly that. I left because I was scared of what staying would mean, Theo admitted, his thumb tracing slow circles against Micah's knuckles. I told myself the wound overseas was punishment for running from you. I know that sounds insane. It sounds, Micah said, throat tight, like the two most stubborn people in Millbrook finally figured out the same thing at the same time. The hardest part wasn't the confession. It was what came after Theo's recovery, slow and humbling, month after month of physical therapy and bad days where the old fear crept back in, where he pulled away out of habit rather than doubt, terrified of being a burden to the one person he'd finally let himself want. There was one brutal night in November when Theo tried to end things before they'd properly begun, insisting Micah deserved someone whole, someone without a cane propped by the door and a limp that ached before rainstorms. Micah didn't argue with grand declarations. He simply showed up the next morning with coffee and his tools, and spent the afternoon fixing a bicycle Theo hadn't ridden in years, saying nothing about love at all, letting his presence answer the question Theo was too afraid to ask directly. By evening, sitting together on the porch steps watching the chain finally spin true again, Theo reached for his hand without a word, and this time he didn't let go. Reezy found out 2 weeks after that, catching them exactly the way siblings always do, mid-laugh, foreheads together over a shared inside joke in the kitchen, and after a stunned beat she only sighed and said, "Finally! I have been waiting since I was 15 for you idiots to catch up to the rest of us." By spring, Theo's limp had softened into something barely noticeable, mostly present in the way he leaned into Micah's shoulder on cold mornings out of habit more than necessity. The violin shop had a new addition, a small workbench by the window where Theo, teaching himself out of restless curiosity, learned to restring instruments alongside the man he loved, sawdust and rosin and quiet Sunday light turning into a kind of ordinary miracle neither of them ever wanted to take for granted again. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the right moment to say the truth out loud. Micah Alden learned that the right moment was never going to arrive on its own, that sometimes you have to build it yourself, out of rainy porches and unfinished sentences and 6 years of almosts, until the person you love finally reaches back. And on the evening Theo slid a small, unpolished ring, one he'd carved the band for himself, uneven and imperfect and entirely theirs, onto Micah's finger on that same porch where everything had started. Micah understood that some doors, once you finally have the courage to open them, don't just change your life. They become the rest of it. Everyone thinks the hardest part of a love story is getting to yes. Nobody warns you about what comes after, the day someone from the past shows up and asks the one question you thought you'd buried for good. Micah and Theo had finally found their peace. But peace, I learned, is never as permanent as you think it is. A letter arrived that spring, one neither of them was prepared for, and it forced both men to face a truth about Theo's time overseas that changed everything they thought they understood about each other. What happened next tested a love that was supposed to be unbreakable. Stay with me, because this is where the real story begins. The letter came on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a violin string invoice, postmarked from a country neither of them had spoken of in months. Micah noticed Theo's hands go still the moment he saw the return address, the easy warmth of that spring morning draining out of the kitchen like someone had opened a window to winter. "Who's it from?" Micah asked, though something in his chest already knew this wasn't going to be simple. "Amara," Theo said quietly. "She ran the clinic I worked at during the flood." He turned the envelope over twice without opening it, like delaying the words might change what they said. "I haven't heard from her since I left." Micah set down his coffee and waited the way he'd learned to wait for Theo, not pushing, just present, the same patience he gave to a violin that needed time before it would sing again. Inside was a request that arrived wrapped in gratitude and guilt in equal measure. The clinic Amara ran had lost its funding. Families Theo had helped during the flood were now facing a health crisis with no one left to answer for it. She wasn't asking Theo to go back permanently. She was asking for 3 months. Just 3 months to help train new volunteers before the clinic closed for good or found new support. "I can't ask you to wait through that again," Theo said that night, sitting across from Micah at the small kitchen table they'd started sharing meals at like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Not after everything it already cost us." "You're not asking," Micah said. "I'm telling you I understand what those people mean to you." His voice caught just slightly on the next part. "I'm just scared of a version of you that doesn't come home whole this time." It wasn't anger that filled the following days, it was something harder to name, a quiet grief for the life they'd only just started building, shadowed by the fear that history might simply repeat itself. Reezy, predictably, had opinions. She cornered Micah in the shop one afternoon while he rehaired a bow with more force than the delicate work required. "You could tell him not to go," she said carefully. "I could," Micah agreed, "but that's not the same as him staying because he wants to." "So what are you going to do?" Micah set the bow down and looked at his best friend, the answer arriving with a clarity that surprised even him. "I'm going with him." It wasn't a decision made lightly. Micah had built his whole adult life around a shop, a rented apartment above a bakery, a rhythm he understood. But he'd spent 6 years being the one who stayed silent, who let fear write the ending before the story had a chance to finish. He wasn't doing that again. Theo resisted at first. 3 months in a region still recovering from disaster was no small thing, and the last time he'd left, it had nearly cost him his leg and his honesty both. But Micah was resolute in a way Theo had never seen before, calm and unshakable, the same steadiness he brought to every fragile, broken instrument that crossed his workbench. "I'm not asking you to protect me from this," Micah told him the night before they left. "I'm asking you to let me stand next to you while you do the thing you were made for." The 3 months that followed were nothing like either of them expected. There were long days of heat and exhaustion, makeshift clinics under tarps that did little against the rain, and nights where Theo sat with patients whose stories broke something open in him every single time. But there was also Micah, learning to be useful in ways he hadn't anticipated, organizing supplies, writing letters home for families who couldn't, and once unexpectedly repairing a battered old guitar that belonged to a boy who hadn't smiled since the flood took his home. It was Amara, watching them from across the courtyard one evening, who said the thing neither of them had put into words yet. "You didn't come back because you had to," she told Theo. "You came back because you finally have someone worth coming back for. That's different, that matters." The hardest night came near the end of their stay, when a supply truck failed to arrive and the clinic ran short on medicine for 3 days straight. Theo barely slept, driven by an old guilt that whispered he was never doing enough, and Micah found him one night sitting alone outside, staring at nothing, the weight of every person he couldn't save pressing down on him like it always had. "You can't fix everything," Micah said softly, sitting beside him. "I know," Theo said, "but I can't stop trying." "I'm not asking you to stop trying," Micah took his hand. "I'm asking you to let someone carry it with you. That's all love is, Theo, not fixing each other, just refusing to let the other one carry it alone." When they finally returned home at the end of summer, it wasn't as 2 men escaping something. It was as 2 men who had chosen each other, deliberately, under conditions far harder than a rainy porch and an unfinished sentence. The violin shop reopened with a small hand-painted sign in the window that Reezy had made without asking, 2 names carved into a single wooden note, Micah and Theo, side by side. Some love stories end at the proposal. They're simply kept going, past fear and distance and every reason either of them once had to run, proving that the truest kind of love isn't the one that never gets tested, It's the one that walks toward the hardest days together and comes home changed but never apart.